A carefully planned revenge. The day I found out felt like stepping into ice water, the chills seeping through my veins and rooting me to the spot. It wasn't some grand, cinematic revelation, no dramatic confrontation. Just a message, innocuous at first glance, left unattended on her phone. A name I didn't recognize paired with words that burned like acid in my mind. "I can't wait to see you again." I remember the room's silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan above. My fingers trembled as I swiped through the thread. It wasn't just a flirtation. There were dates, secret rendezvous, and confessions that twisted my stomach into knots. The betrayal wasn't new. It was a tapestry of lies, woven over weeks, perhaps months, while I had been blissfully unaware. I put the phone back where I found it, my heart pounding against my ribs. My mind raced, cycling through emotions too fast to process. Disbelief, anger, heartbreak, and a simmering sense of resolve. But I didn't confront her. Not then. Not yet. No, I thought, this deserves more than a shouting match. She deserves to feel every ounce of what she's done, and so the planning began. I spent the days that followed as if walking on a tightrope, careful not to let my growing anger reveal itself too soon. I observed her more closely, my senses heightened. Every smile she flashed, every excuse for a late meeting, every absent-minded hum as she cooked dinner. It all felt staged now, rehearsed. A facade meant to keep me in the dark, but beneath my surface calm, a storm brewed. The betrayal was no longer a sharp pain. It had settled into a dull ache, a constant reminder of her duplicity. And as I stewed in my emotions, my resolve solidified. If she could craft a double life so seamlessly, so could I. The thought brought a strange, bitter satisfaction. I began laying the groundwork for my revenge like an architect sketching blueprints. Every piece of the plan required precision and patience. It wasn't enough to catch her in the act. No, I wanted to dismantle the very foundation of her lies, brick by brick, and leave her with nothing but the truth she had worked so hard to bury. The preparations. The first step was to gather evidence, but not in a frantic, obvious way. I installed a small app on her phone, discreet, undetectable. It allowed me to see her texts and calls without leaving a trace. Each new piece of information felt like a dagger in my chest, but I forced myself to endure it. Her messages to him were sickeningly sweet, filled with pet names and promises that had once been mine alone. But the real coup came when I discovered the location of their next rendezvous, a boutique hotel on the outskirts of town. Perfect, I thought, my mind already racing ahead to the possibilities. I booked a room at the same hotel, directly across from theirs, under a pseudonym. The idea was to be close enough to see, to record, to witness every moment of their betrayal, with my own eyes. But merely witnessing wasn't enough. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had done, to see her carefully constructed reality crumble. I began assembling the pieces, photos of our happy moments together, anniversary cards, and little keepsakes that now felt like cruel jokes. I compiled them into a beautifully arranged scrapbook, but at the back, I reserved space for the evidence I had gathered, their texts, screenshots of her calls, and photos I planned to take that night. The inner conflict, as the day drew closer, doubt crept in like a shadow. What if she denies it? What if this destroys me more than it destroys her? Late at night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a whirlwind of anger, pain, and fear. But then I would remember the texts, her laughter on the phone when she thought I wasn't listening, the way she had come home late one night smelling of a cologne that wasn't mine. Each memory stoked the fire within me, burning away any hesitation. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my sense of self. She had stolen something from me, and I intended to take it back. The execution. The night arrived, heavy with anticipation. I arrived at the hotel early, checking into my room and ensuring everything was ready. The camera was positioned discreetly, the scrapbook tucked into my bag, its pages heavy with the weight of my broken trust. Through the peephole, I watched as they entered the room across the hall, their laughter carrying faintly through the corridor. My stomach churned, a cocktail of nausea and adrenaline. But I held steady, focusing on the plan. I waited for what felt like hours, each passing moment sharpening my resolve. Finally, when the timing felt right, I sent her a message. "Come across the hall. I have something to show you." Her reply was almost immediate. "What are you talking about?" I smiled, the kind that didn't quite reach my eyes, and texted back, "You'll want to see this." The confrontation. The seconds stretched into eternity as I waited. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs. I could hear her muffled voice through the door. She was talking to him, her tone tinged with confusion. Then the doorknob across the hall turned, and her footsteps echoed softly on the carpet. I opened the door before she could knock. Her face was a mixture of surprise and dread, her hand frozen mid-air. She looked stunning, as she always did, her hair falling in perfect waves, her makeup subtle but immaculate. For a moment, I felt the ghost of my old admiration for her, but it evaporated under the weight of what I knew. What are you doing here?" she stammered, her eyes darting past me to the room beyond, as if searching for an explanation. I stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. "We need to talk," I said evenly, though my voice carried the sharp edge of barely restrained anger. She hesitated, then walked in, her movements cautious, as if she were stepping into a trap. And in a way, she was. I closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment, gathering myself. My hands were trembling, and I clenched them into fists to steady them. "Is this about work?" she asked, her voice overly casual. She perched on the edge of the bed, her posture rigid. I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound that filled the room. "Work?" I repeated. "No, this isn't about work. This is about him." Her face paled, the color draining from her cheeks as if I'd struck her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly, too quickly. Her eyes darted to the door, and I could see the beginnings of panic in her expression. I walked to the desk, where the scrapbook lay closed, waiting. My fingers brushed over its cover, and for a moment I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Grief, perhaps, for what we had been. Then I picked it up and handed it to her. "Open it," I said, my voice cold, detached. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she took the book. Slowly, she flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the photos of our vacations, our anniversaries, the little notes we'd written to each other. Her expression softened briefly, a flicker of the woman I'd once loved. But then she turned to the final section, the one filled with the evidence of her betrayal. Her breath hitched audibly. "Where did you get these?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't matter," I said, crossing my arms. "What matters is that I know everything, and now you do too." She looked up at me, her eyes wide, glistening with unshed tears. "It's not what you think." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult me by lying anymore. I've seen the messages. I've seen you. I've heard you." My voice cracked, and I swallowed hard, forcing the emotions back, down. "How long, huh? How long have you been making me look like a fool?" Her tears spilled over now, streaking her cheeks. "I never meant for it to happen," she choked out. "I was lonely, and you were so distant. Don't you dare blame me for this," I said, my voice rising. "I was distant because I trusted you." because I thought we were happy. But you decided that wasn't enough. For a moment, the room was silent except for her quiet sobs. I watched her, my heart a storm of conflicting emotions. Anger, sorrow, a lingering trace of love that made this hurt all the more. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "Can we fix this?" she asked. "Please, I'll end it. I'll do whatever it takes." I shook my head slowly. "Fix this?" I repeated, my voice hollow. "There's no fixing this. You broke it. You broke us." She started to speak. Again, but I held up a hand. "I don't want your excuses. I don't want your apologies. I just wanted you to see what you've done, to feel even a fraction of what I felt." I walked to the door and opened it. "Now go," I said. "Go back to him or don't. I don't care. But don't come back to me." She hesitated, her face crumpling as if she might say something else, but then she nodded, wiping her tears, and walked out without another word. As the door clicked shut behind her, I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty room. The weight of everything settled on me then, heavy and suffocating. I had gotten my revenge, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like ashes, the aftermath. The silence of the room was unbearable once she left. For a long time, I stood motionless by the door, my hand resting on the doorknob as if keeping it closed might hold back the tidal wave of emotions threatening to engulf me. My mind replayed the confrontation in sharp, vivid detail, every word cutting into me anew. I had wanted her to feel my pain, but now, alone in this empty room, it was clear I hadn't escaped unscathed. I collapsed onto the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, and let the reality of it all wash over me. The betrayal, the confrontation, the finality of her walking out, all of it felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unravel. I had spent weeks planning this, but I hadn't planned for what came after. Rebuilding myself. The first few days were the hardest. The weight of her absence was both a relief and a hollow ache. Every corner of the house reminded me of her. The faint scent of her perfume lingering in the bedroom, the half-empty bottle of wine we'd meant to finish together. I couldn't escape her ghost, no matter where I turned. To distract myself, I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects and working late into the night. But even that wasn't enough. The quiet moments in between were the worst, the stillness amplifying the questions I couldn't answer. Was I not enough? Was there something I could have done differently? In those moments, I turned to the gym. It started as a way to burn off the restless energy coursing through me, but soon it became something more. Every push-up, every mile on the treadmill, every drop of sweat felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. It wasn't just about the physical, it was about proving to myself that I could endure, that I could rebuild from the ashes of what she'd left behind. Letting go weeks turned into months, and the sharp edges of the pain began to dull. I didn't hear from her, and I didn't reach out. The scrapbook I had made sat untouched in a drawer, a reminder of a life I no longer wanted to revisit. Occasionally, I would wonder about her. If she was still with him, if she regretted what she'd done. But those thoughts came less frequently as time passed. Instead, I focused on myself. I started therapy, hesitant at first, but quickly realizing how much I needed it. Talking to someone who wasn't emotionally invested, who could see things clearly, helped me untangle the mess in my head. They helped me understand that her betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth, but of her own choices and flaws. The turning point one day, I found myself walking through the park, the crisp autumn air biting at my cheeks. The trees were ablaze with color, their leaves scattering like confetti in the wind. For the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't in months: peace. I sat on a bench, watching the world go by, and realized that I didn't feel the anger anymore. The pain was still there, but it had settled into something manageable, a scar rather than an open wound. I wasn't the person I had been before her betrayal, but I was okay with that. I was stronger now, more resilient. A small smile tugged at my lips as I watched a group of children chase each other through the leaves. Life went on, messy and unpredictable, but beautiful in its own way. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to move forward, to open myself to the possibility of new beginnings, unburdened by the weight of the past. The first steps toward something new. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the first drops of rain before a storm. I wasn't looking for anything. I didn't feel ready. My heart still bore the bruises of betrayal, and the idea of letting someone in again seemed distant, even foolish. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Her name was Elena. I met her at a local bookstore, a quiet haven I'd often retreated to since the fallout. She was standing in the philosophy aisle, her head tilted as she studied the spines of the books. Her hair was a rich auburn, tied back, in a loose braid that trailed over her shoulder. She wore a cream sweater, slightly oversized, with sleeves that brushed her knuckles. There was something about her that drew my attention, something unassuming, yet magnetic. I wasn't planning to speak to her. I wasn't planning anything at all, but as I reached for a book on the shelf, my arm brushed hers. "Oh, sorry," she said, turning toward me with an apologetic smile. Her voice was soft, with a lilting cadence that made the words linger. "It's fine," I said, glancing at the book in her hand. The Myth of Sisyphus. "A Camus fan?" She looked surprised, then nodded. "Something about existentialism feels oddly comforting," she said, her smile widening slightly. "Like even if life is meaningless, we still get to decide what it means for us." Her words caught me off guard. I hadn't expected such depth from a casual exchange, and for a moment I was at a loss for how to respond. "That's a surprisingly optimistic take for Camus," I said finally, and she laughed, a soft, melodic sound that warmed the space between us. An unexpected connection. What began as a chance meeting turned into a series of small encounters. We'd run into each other at the bookstore a few more times, each interaction feeling like a continuation of the last. There was an ease to her presence, a quiet confidence that put me at ease. She asked questions that made me think, her curiosity genuine and unassuming. Eventually, she suggested grabbing coffee. I hesitated for a moment, the ghost of my past, whispering doubts into my ear. But something about Elena made it hard to say no. So I agreed, and we found ourselves in a cozy cafe, steam rising from our cups as the world outside blurred into a rainy haze. "So," she said, her eyes fixed on me, bright and attentive. "What's your story?" I hesitated, my fingers tracing the rim of my cup. "It's complicated," I admitted. "Not exactly a fairy tale." She tilted her head, her expression softening. "I like complicated," she said simply. "It's honest." Something in her tone disarmed me. Slowly, cautiously, I began to share bits of my past. Not everything, but enough to give her a glimpse of the man behind the guarded exterior. She listened without judgment, her gaze never wavering. And when I finished, she offered a quiet smile. "That sounds painful," she said, "but it also sounds like you've come a long way." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Her words felt like a balm, soothing wounds I hadn't realized were still raw. The risk of vulnerability. As weeks turned into months, Elena and I grew closer. She wasn't like anyone I'd known before. There was no pretense with her, no games. She was open, genuine, and unafraid to be vulnerable, a quality I found both terrifying and irresistible. But with that closeness came fear. There were nights when I lay awake, my mind racing with doubts. What if she hurts me too? What if I'm not enough? The scars from my past hadn't vanished. They lingered, a constant reminder of what could go wrong. One evening, as we walked along the river, the city lights reflecting off the water, I found myself voicing those fears. "I'm not sure I know how to do this," I admitted, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. "After everything that happened, trusting someone again feels impossible." Elena stopped and turned to face me, her expression thoughtful. "It's not about knowing how," she said. "It's about being willing to try. Trust isn't something you have to give all at once. It's something you build little by little." Her words struck a chord, resonating in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time, I felt the faintest flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could let someone in again. The new beginning. Our relationship didn't come easily. It was messy, awkward at times, and fraught with moments of doubt. But it was also filled with moments of joy. Quiet mornings spent reading together, spontaneous adventures to new places, and conversations that stretched long into the night. Elena didn't try to fix me or erase my past. Instead, she stood beside me, patient and steady, as I worked to rebuild myself. And in doing so, she became a part of that process, not as a replacement for what I'd lost, but as a reminder of what was still possible. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I thought I'd lost forever, a sense of belonging. Navigating the new terrain, Elena and I weren't without our struggles. Relationships, I realized, were less about perfection and more about persistence, about showing up, even when things got difficult. And they did get difficult. There were moments when my fears resurfaced, triggered by something as innocuous as a delayed text or a moment of silence. I would retreat into myself, the old defenses snapping into place, and Elena would have to coax me out, her patience never wavering. One such moment came during a dinner party at her apartment. It was the first time she'd invited me to meet her friends, a close-knit group of artists and writers who buzzed with energy and conversation. I wanted to impress them, to fit into her world, but halfway through the evening, I felt the old insecurities creeping in. I wasn't like them, creative, carefree, untethered by the weight of the past. "You okay?" Elena asked, catching me, standing alone on the balcony, my drink untouched. I hesitated, staring out at the city lights. "I don't know if I belong here," I admitted. "Your friends, they're amazing. And me? I'm just me." She stepped closer, her presence grounding me. "You're more than enough," she said softly. "And if they can't see that, it's their loss." Her words, simple as they were, pulled me back from the edge. It wasn't the first time she'd reminded me of my worth, and it wouldn't be the last. Slowly, I began to trust her belief in me, even when I struggled to see it myself. The weight of the past. Despite our progress, the shadow of my past lingered. One evening, as we sat curled up on her couch, she asked the question I'd been dreading. "Do you ever think about her?" she said, her voice careful, as if treading on thin ice. I sighed, staring down at the mug of tea in my hands. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Not in the way you might think. It's not about missing her. It's about the questions she left behind, the doubts." Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she reached out, placing her hand over mine. "It's okay to have those doubts," she said. "They don't make you weak. They make you human." Her understanding took me by surprise. I had expected her to feel threatened by my honesty, but instead, she seemed to welcome it. It was moments like these that reminded me why I was falling for her, because she wasn't afraid of the messy, complicated parts of me. Building together, as time went on, we began to build a life together. Not just in the physical sense, but emotionally. We shared our fears, our dreams, our vulnerabilities, weaving them into something stronger than either of us could have created alone. She taught me to appreciate the little things again, the smell of rain on a summer evening, the way sunlight filtered through the curtains in the morning. In turn, I taught her to take chances. Elena, for all her confidence, had her own fears of failure, of rejection, of stepping outside her comfort zone. Together, we pushed each other to grow, to reach beyond what felt safe. One day, as we sat in the park where we'd first realized our connection, she turned to me with a smile. "You know," she said, "I think we're both a little broken." I raised an eyebrow, caught off guard. "Thanks," she laughed, shaking her head. "No, I mean it in a good way. We've both been through things that changed us, but instead of letting it break us completely, we've found ways to put the pieces back together. And maybe that's why this works." Her words stayed with me long after that day. She was right, of course. We weren't perfect, far from it, but in our imperfection, we had found something rare and beautiful. We had found each other, a future unfolding. I won't pretend that every day was easy, or that all our challenges were neatly resolved. But what mattered was that we faced them together. And as I stood in the doorway of our apartment one evening, watching Elena hum to herself while she painted, I realized something. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking back. I wasn't haunted by what I'd lost, or what could have been. I was here, in this moment, with someone who saw me for who I was and chose to stay. And that, more than anything, was enough. The storm beneath the surface. As much as Elena and I tried to move forward, challenges emerged that neither of us could ignore. The ghosts of our respective pasts had a way of creeping in, uninvited. For me, it was trust, a fragile thing I was still learning to rebuild. For Elena, it was the fear of being left behind, a remnant of her own history with an absent father and a string of unreliable relationships. One evening, after a long day at work, I arrived at her apartment to find her pacing the living room, her face tight with worry. "What's wrong?" I asked, setting my bag down. She stopped mid-step, her arms crossed defensively. "You didn't text me back," she said, her voice clipped. I blinked, confused. "I was in meetings all day. I didn't have a chance." "You always find time," she interrupted, her tone sharper now. "What was so important that you couldn't send a 2-second text?" Her accusation hit harder than I expected, igniting something raw in me. "Elena, I'm not your ex," I snapped before I could stop myself. "I'm not going to disappear on you." Her eyes widened, a flicker of hurt crossing her face before she masked it with anger. "Don't throw that in my face," she said. "You don't get to use my past against me. And you don't get to punish me for something I didn't." "Do," I shot back, my voice rising. The argument spiraled from there, each of us saying things we didn't mean, our words cutting deeper than either of us intended. By the time it was over, Elena was sitting on the edge of the couch, her head in her hands, and I was standing by the window, my chest tight with regret. Repairing the fractures. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. I wanted to say something to bridge the gap between us, but the words wouldn't come. It was Elena who finally broke the quiet. "I don't want to fight with you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But sometimes I get scared. And I don't know how to stop." Her vulnerability disarmed me. Slowly, I crossed the room and sat beside her, my hand resting on the couch between us. "I get scared too," I admitted, my voice low. "Of losing you, of messing this up." She looked up at me, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Then, why do we keep hurting each other?" "Because we're human," I said, my voice breaking, "and we're trying. But it's not easy." We sat there for a long time, the weight of our words settling between us. Eventually, I reached for her hand, threading my fingers through hers. "I don't have all the answers," I said, "but I know I want to figure this out. With you." She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Me too. Learning to communicate. After that night, we made a conscious effort to address our issues rather than letting them fester. It wasn't easy. Old habits die hard, and there were times when we stumbled. But we started having more honest conversations, even when they were uncomfortable. Elena opened up about her fear of abandonment, explaining how it stemmed from her father leaving when she was a child. I shared my struggles with trust, admitting how my ex-wife's betrayal had left me questioning everything, including my own judgment. Through these conversations, we began to understand each other on a deeper level. And while the process wasn't without its setbacks, it brought us closer in ways we hadn't anticipated. A test of strength. Our biggest challenge came 6 months into our relationship when Elena was offered a job in another city, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to curate an art exhibit that could launch her career to new heights. She was ecstatic, but the offer came with a catch. It would mean moving 3 hours away. "I don't want to lose this," she said one evening, her voice heavy with uncertainty. "But I don't want to lose you either." The fear in her eyes mirrored my own. Part of me wanted to ask her to stay, to choose me over the job, but I knew that wasn't fair, nor was it the kind of love I wanted to offer her. "You should take it," I said finally, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "This is your dream." Her expression was a mix of relief and heartbreak. "But what about us?" "We'll figure it out," I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. "If this is meant to last, we'll find a way." The distance between us. The months that followed were some of the hardest we'd faced. The distance tested us in ways we hadn't anticipated, forcing us to rely on late-night phone calls and weekend visits to keep our connection alive. There were moments of doubt, of frustration, when it felt like the miles between us were insurmountable. But there were also moments of beauty. Like the time she surprised me by showing up at my doorstep on a random Tuesday, or the night we spent talking until dawn, her voice a lifeline through the phone. In those moments, I realized something important. Love wasn't about never facing challenges. It was about choosing each other again and again. A new chapter begins. With Elena back in the city, it felt like we were starting fresh, but with the scars and lessons of everything we'd been through. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, a shared knowledge that love wasn't something that simply existed. It had to be built, nurtured, and above all, chosen every single day. But as much as we wanted to focus on the future, life had a way of throwing curveballs. Elena's return wasn't without complications. Her work had gained attention, and with it came new opportunities and new pressures. Meanwhile, I found myself facing a promotion at work, one that promised more responsibility but also more stress. Our individual successes, while exciting, threatened to pull us in different directions again. The balancing act one evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I came home to find Elena sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by sketches and notes. She was so engrossed in her work that she didn't hear me come in. "Hey," I said softly, setting my bag down. She glanced up, startled, then smiled. "Hey, sorry, I lost track of time. There's a deadline for a new proposal." And "It's fine," I said, but the fatigue in my voice betrayed me. Her smile faltered, and she set her pen down. "You okay?" I hesitated, unsure how to put my feelings into words. "I'm tired," I admitted finally. "It feels like we're both so busy lately and I don't know how to keep up." She frowned, her gaze dropping to her sketches. "I know. I've been feeling it too." For a moment, the silence between us was heavy, and I worried we were slipping back into old patterns, letting the distance grow without addressing it. But then she reached out, taking my hand in hers. "What if we made more time?" she asked. "For us, I mean, even if it's just small moments." Like what? I asked, curious. Like a standing date night, she said. No work, no distractions, just us. I smiled, the tension in my chest easing slightly. I'd like that. Navigating success together as we implemented these small changes, weekly, date nights, morning coffee runs together, even setting aside time to talk before bed. I realized how much I'd missed these moments. They weren't grand gestures, but they reminded me why I'd fallen for her in the first place. Still, there were hiccups. One night, during a particularly stressful week, I canceled our date night to work late on a project. Elena understood, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. We'll reschedule, I promised, kissing her cheek. Just don't forget about us, she said softly. Her words stayed with me, a reminder of how easy it was to let life's demands overshadow what truly mattered. Facing old wounds, even as we grew closer, there were moments when the wounds of our past resurfaced. One day, while cleaning out my apartment to make space for Elena's things, I stumbled across an old photo of my ex-wife and me. I stared at it for a long moment, my chest tightening. I hadn't thought about her in months, but seeing her face brought back a flood of memories, both good and bad. I debated whether to keep the photo or throw it away, unsure what it meant to hold on to a piece of my past. Hey, Elena's voice broke through my thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her brow furrowed as she noticed the photo in my hand. I hesitated, unsure how to explain. I found this while cleaning, I said finally. She nodded, her expression unreadable. What are you going to do with it? I don't know, I admitted. Part of me thinks I should get rid of it, but another part wonders if it's wrong to erase that part of my life. Elena stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm. It's not wrong to hold on to the past, she said, as long as you're not living in it. Her words gave me clarity. I set the photo down, deciding to store it away rather than throw it out. It was a part of my story, but it didn't define my future. Building a life together as the months went on, Elena and I found our rhythm. We learned to navigate the complexities of our individual lives while building something shared. There were still challenges, arguments, insecurities, moments of doubt, but we faced them head-on, knowing that the effort was worth it. One evening, as we sat on the couch planning our first trip together, I looked over at her and realized how far we'd come. We weren't perfect, but we were real, and that was enough. The journey together. Elena and I decided on Italy for our first trip together, a place rich in art, history, and romance, a perfect reflection of our personalities. She was eager to explore the museums and ancient ruins, her passion for art, leading the way, while I looked forward to savoring the food and immersing myself in the culture. The trip came at the perfect time. After months of balancing work, personal growth, and our relationship, we both needed a break, a chance to step away from the routine and focus solely on each other. New horizons. We landed in Florence on a crisp spring morning. The air smelled of fresh bread and espresso, and the narrow cobblestone streets buzzed with life. As we strolled through the city, hand in hand, I couldn't help but feel a sense of renewal, as though this trip marked the beginning of a new chapter for us. Our first stop was the Uffizi Gallery, a place Elena had dreamed of visiting for years. Watching her move through the exhibits, her eyes alight with wonder, was mesmerizing. She spoke with such passion about the brushstrokes, the symbolism, and the history behind each piece that I found myself seeing the art through her eyes, appreciating it in ways I never had before. You light up when you talk about this, I said as we stood before Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. She smiled, her cheeks flushing. Art has always been my escape, my way of understanding the world. And now? I asked, tilting my head. Now, she said, looking up at me, it's part of how I share it with you. moments of vulnerability. But the trip wasn't without its challenges. One evening, after a long day exploring Tuscany's rolling vineyards, we found ourselves in a quiet corner of a rustic trattoria. Over a bottle of Chianti, we began talking about the future, a topic that had always been tinged with uncertainty for both of us. "What do you see for us?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. I took a moment to gather my thoughts, the weight of her question settling over me. "I see a home," I said finally. "Not just a physical place, but a feeling. Wherever we are, as long as we're together." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she smiled. "I like that," she said. "But what if we want different things?" "We'll figure it out," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "We always do." The conversation lingered in my mind that night as we walked back to our hotel under the warm glow of streetlights. It was a reminder that, while love could be grounding, it also required constant negotiation and compromise. A proposal of sorts. On our last day in Italy, as we stood on the Ponte Vecchio watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt an overwhelming urge to say something, to solidify what we had in some way. "Elena," I began, my voice barely audible, over the hum of the river below. She turned to me, her expression curious. "What is it?" I hesitated, my heart pounding. I know we've been through a lot, together and apart, and I know neither of us is perfect. But I also know that I don't want to go through life without you. Her eyes widened, and for a moment I worried I'd said too much, too soon. But then she smiled, her hand slipping into mine. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. It wasn't a formal proposal, not yet, but it felt like a promise, one that we both understood without needing further explanation. Building a future. When we returned home, we began taking steps toward building the life we'd imagined during our trip. We found a cozy apartment together, one filled with sunlight and space for Elena's art projects. I started making time to learn about her passions, even picking up a paintbrush myself on occasion, while she surprised me by learning to cook some of my favorite meals. We also navigated the complexities of merging our lives, introducing each other to friends and family, balancing work with time together, and making room for our individual interests and goals. There were arguments, of course, moments when our differences threatened to pull us apart, but they were always followed by reconciliation and growth. Family dynamics and new challenges. Meeting Elena's family was a turning point for us. Her mother was warm and welcoming, but her father, a stoic man with a sharp gaze, was harder to win over. During our first dinner together, he asked me pointedly, "What makes you think you can give her the life she deserves?" The question caught me off guard, but I met his gaze steadily. "Because I know what it's like to lose something precious," I said, "and I won't let that happen again." He nodded slowly as if weighing my words, and while his approval wasn't immediate, it was a start. On my side, introducing Elena to my parents was equally complex. My mother adored her, but my father, still bitter about my divorce, was skeptical. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked me privately one evening. "I'm sure," I said. Family tensions and growing pains, navigating our families, proved to be one of our greatest challenges, as their opinions and expectations often clashed with our vision for the future. Elena's father remained reserved, his approval inching forward in reluctant increments. Each visit to her childhood home felt like a test, his questions probing my intentions, my ability to provide, and even my commitment. During one dinner, he asked pointedly, "What if Elena decides to pursue a career overseas again? Are you ready to uproot your life for hers?" The question hit a nerve. I hadn't fully considered the possibility, but I knew this moment demanded honesty. "If that's what she wants, we'll figure it out," I said. "Because being with her is more important to me than where we live." His brow furrowed, but he didn't press further. Later that evening, Elena squeezed my hand as we drove home. "You handled that well," she said softly. "Did I?" I replied, the tension still knotting my shoulders. "You did," she assured me. "He's just protective. It doesn't mean he doesn't like you." Career pressures and crossroads at work, the promotion I'd once celebrated began to feel like a weight. Late nights, demanding clients, and constant deadlines left little time for anything else. Elena, too, faced mounting pressure as her designs gained recognition, with galleries and clients vying for her attention. One evening, I came home to find her pacing the living room, her phone in hand. "What's wrong?" I asked. "I got an offer," she said, her voice tight. "A gallery in Paris wants to feature my work. It's a huge opportunity, but it's in Paris," I finished for her. She nodded, her eyes searching mine. "I don't want to leave you, not after everything we've built." I hesitated, torn between pride for her success and fear of what it might mean for us. "You shouldn't turn it down because of me," I said finally. "This is your dream, Elena." Her expression softened, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. "And you're mine," she said quietly. "We'll figure this out. Together." Turning points as Elena prepared for her Paris exhibition, I found myself reflecting on the sacrifices we'd both made, and the ones still to come. One night, over takeout and wine, we had a long, honest conversation about our future. "What do you want, really?" I asked her, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "I want to share my art with the world," she said. "But I also want a life with you. I don't want to choose between them." "Then don't," I said. "We'll make it work. Whether that means long distance for a while or me joining you in Paris, we'll figure it out." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table to take my hand. "Thank you," she whispered. A trial of distance. The months leading up to her departure were bittersweet. We made the most of our time together, savoring every moment while preparing for the inevitable separation. When the day finally came, I stood with her at the airport, my heart heavy but resolute. "I'll visit as often as I can," I promised, pulling her into a tight embrace. "And I'll call every day," she said, her voice trembling. As I watched her walk through the gate, I felt the weight of her absence immediately, but I also felt something else: hope. This wasn't an end. It was another step in our journey. Lessons in love and sacrifice. The distance tested us in ways we hadn't anticipated. Time zone differences and busy schedules made communication difficult, and there were moments when the strain felt unbearable. But each time we faltered, we reminded ourselves why we were doing this, why we were fighting for each other. When I visited her in Paris, it felt like coming home. She showed me her new world, her excitement infectious as she introduced me to the city she'd come to love. And in those moments, I realized something important. Love wasn't about avoiding challenges. It was about facing them together, knowing the struggle was worth it. The next phase. After a year of balancing our lives across continents, we made a decision. I would transfer to my company's European branch, a move that allowed us to finally close the distance. The process wasn't easy, but as we stood in our new Paris apartment, surrounded by unpacked boxes and a world of possibilities, I knew we'd made the right choice. "This is it," Elena said, leaning against me as we gazed out at the city. "Lights." "This is just the beginning," I replied, wrapping an arm around her. Life in Paris. A new beginning. The first few weeks in Paris felt like a whirlwind, a dream and a challenge all at once. Our tiny apartment in the Marais district was charming, but cramped, with its high ceilings and narrow windows that overlooked the cobblestone streets below. Elena thrived in the city's energy, her creative juices flowing freely as she dove into her work. She spent hours in galleries, meeting with artists and curators, and I watched her become more connected to the artistic heartbeat of the city. It was thrilling to see her so alive, so immersed in her purpose. For me, the adjustment wasn't as seamless. Though the company transition had been smooth, the language barrier, the cultural nuances, and the sense of being an outsider in a city that was both alien and familiar gnawed at me. Yet Paris had a way of drawing me in. There was a quiet magic to it, a rhythm to the city that I had to learn to dance to. I spent my days working, trying to navigate this new environment, while at night I'd wander the streets of Paris, getting lost in the neighborhoods, discovering hidden cafes, bookstores, and quiet parks where I could think. The strain of change. But even amidst the enchantment of Paris, the strain of change began to show. We both had our own worlds, mine anchored in the corporate grind and hers in the art scene, and sometimes it felt as though our paths barely crossed. The times when we did come together were often punctuated by silence, as though the weight of our respective responsibilities filled the spaces between us. One evening, after a particularly long day, I returned home to find Elena standing by the window, staring out at the Seine, lost in thought. "Elena?" I said softly, approaching her. She didn't turn around immediately, but I could see the tension in her posture. When she did finally face me, her expression was tired, but there was a softness to it. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can keep this up. The work, the constant deadlines, the pressure." I reached for her, brushing her hair back from her face. "We knew it wouldn't be easy," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "But we're doing this together, right?" She sighed, resting her head on my chest. "I don't want to lose sight of why we're here, you and me." I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close. "We won't. We just have to find balance." Building a new routine. As the days turned into weeks, Elena and I began carving out a new routine, one that prioritized both of our careers and our relationship. We woke early, sometimes running through the streets of Paris together, laughing as we passed familiar landmarks. On weekends, we explored different parts of the city, hidden gardens, underground art exhibits, and quiet bistros. But we also took time for ourselves. I would often head out to the countryside on weekends for a quiet retreat, while Elena, needing her own space, would spend hours painting or reading in solitude. I began to appreciate these moments of separation as much. As I valued our shared experiences, they gave us room to grow individually, strengthening the bond we were building together. A moment of crisis. Still, not everything was smooth sailing. One evening, Elena came home later than usual, her eyes tired, her shoulders tense. I was sitting at the kitchen table working on some reports when she walked in, the sound of the door closing heavy in the silence. "Long day?" I asked, looking up. She nodded, but it was clear there was something more. "I don't know, I feel like I'm losing myself in all of this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I moved here for the opportunities for us, but I don't know if I'm still the same person I was before." I stood up and walked over to her, reaching for her hands. "What do you need?" I asked, my voice steady but filled with concern. She paused, her gaze distant. "I don't know. I just feel like I'm not in control anymore, like I'm being swept away by everything." The vulnerability in her voice struck a chord deep inside me. I understood her fear because, in some ways, I felt it too. "You're still you," I said, pulling her into an embrace. "And we're still us. We just need to figure out how to make space for both." Recalibrating our priorities. It took time, but we gradually found a way to recalibrate. We both realized that we couldn't pour ourselves entirely into our work without giving ourselves permission to breathe and connect. Elena started taking more breaks, stepping away from her projects to recharge. I made more of an effort to disconnect from work, setting boundaries that allowed us to spend real, uninterrupted time together. One Sunday morning, as we sipped coffee on the balcony of our apartment, I looked out over the city, the sun casting golden light across the rooftops. "We're figuring it out, aren't we?" I said, a soft smile tugging at my lips. Elena leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. The path ahead. The uncharted future. The days that followed the proposal were a blur of joy, excitement, and the sweet anticipation of what lay ahead. The quiet moments in Paris were now shared with a new sense of purpose, each corner of the city holding a promise, a memory to be made together. We walked through the Jardin des Tuileries hand in hand, weaving through the tall hedges and statues, both of us silently imagining our lives entwined more deeply than ever before. The city, always vibrant, now felt even more alive, as though the streets themselves were whispering of our shared future. Yet, even with the golden glow of engagement casting warmth over our lives, the reality of our commitments, both personal and professional, never quite ceased to press against us. Building a life beyond career and art. The following months were filled with endless conversations, some lighthearted, some fraught with the weight of decisions. Elena and I had always been grounded in our own aspirations, her art, my career, but as the wedding loomed, we began to confront the unspoken tension between us. How would we balance our dreams with our desire to be together? Elena had been offered another major exhibition in London, but it was scheduled for the same week as our wedding. Her excitement was palpable, yet I could see the hesitation in her eyes when she mentioned it. "Do you want me to turn it down?" she asked one evening, her voice tinged with doubt. "I can, but I'm scared. I don't want to lose this momentum, you know?" I felt a pang of guilt, understanding the pull of her ambition. I think we both knew this moment would come. "You've worked so hard for this opportunity, Elena. I'm not going to ask you to choose between your career and me. We'll make it work." Her eyes softened. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not easy, but we're a team," I said, my voice steady, even though doubt lingered in my chest. "We've always been able to find our way, balancing career and love." In the weeks leading up to the wedding, we found ourselves walking the delicate line between supporting each other's dreams and creating a space for our love to flourish. There were late-night talks about whether we should move to a new city together or continue splitting our time between Paris, London, and wherever life might take us. One night, as we sat on the balcony, the city stretching out before us, I turned to her. "I don't care where we live. I just want to be with you. I'll support whatever you decide." She smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. "And I'll do the same for you. I just want us to keep growing, together." The wedding, a dream. Realized. The day of our wedding came faster than we could have ever anticipated, and Paris became the backdrop to our dreams, a city of love and possibility now bound to our own story. I watched her walk down the aisle, the glow of her smile, brighter than the sun, her dress flowing behind her like a river of light. My heart stuttered in my chest. But it wasn't fear that gripped me. It was wonder. Wonder that I was about to marry the woman who had transformed my life, who had pushed me to become a better version of myself. Our vows were whispered, barely, audible over the sound of our hearts beating in sync. "I promise to always choose you," I said, feeling the weight of every word. "I promise to always choose us," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. And as we exchanged rings, I realized that our journey had only just begun. After the wedding, new beginnings. The months after our wedding were a mix of adventure and adjustment, each day a new chapter in our shared story. We traveled between cities, navigating the complexities of blending our work and love lives. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience, communication, and the occasional compromise. We began to understand that no matter where we were, what mattered most was that we were together. One afternoon, while exploring the streets of Montmartre, Elena turned to me with a question that had been brewing in her mind for some time. "Do you think we're ready for children?" she asked, her voice tentative but hopeful. The question caught me off guard. It was a question we'd both danced around, unsure of when or if it was the right time. But now, with the clarity of our shared life ahead, I found my response rooted in truth. "I think I'm ready. With you," I said, pulling her into my arms. "I've never been more sure of anything." She smiled, her fingers tracing the lines of my palm. "Then maybe it's time to start thinking about that next step." And so, with a sense of peace, we took the next step in our journey together, knowing that our future was one we would build side by side, no matter the challenges that came our way. The next chapter. As the seasons changed, so too did our lives. We continued to grow in our individual careers, but now we were building something else, something deeper. The next chapter. Embracing the unknown. In the months that followed, our life took on a rhythm that felt both familiar and completely new. We had found a balance between our careers and personal lives, but the unpredictability of the future loomed, just beyond the horizon, waiting for us to embrace it. There was a quiet urgency in the air, as we both knew that the next phase of our journey was just around the corner, one that would require more than what we had ever anticipated. The pregnancy revelation. It was Elena who first broached the subject one evening as we sat in our cozy apartment overlooking the twinkling lights of the city. She had been quiet for a while, watching the world go by, lost in thought. When she turned to face me, there was a soft glow to her eyes and a nervous tension in the air. "Do you ever think about having children?" she asked, her voice quiet but full of meaning. I looked at her, my mind briefly blank before clarity washed over me. We had been discussing this for months, wondering when would be the right time, if we were ready for such a change. But her question held more weight now, as if she had come to a realization of her own. "I think about it all the time," I replied, my voice steady. "But I've always been afraid of the unknown, of how it would change everything, of how it would change us." Her lips curved into a tender smile, a mix of understanding and love. "I know. I felt that too. But what if it doesn't change us? What if it just adds to what we already have?" The tenderness in her words pierced through my defenses, and in that moment I realized that I wasn't afraid of what would change. I was afraid of losing the connection we shared. But I also knew that what we had was strong enough to survive the changes life threw our way. "I'm not sure how it will be," I said, reaching out to take her hand. "But I want to take that step with you." Her eyes softened as she squeezed my hand. "Then we'll figure it out together." And just like that, a new chapter opened before us. Anticipation and preparation. The months of pregnancy were filled with a mixture of anticipation, excitement, and nervousness. Elena's body, once so familiar to me, began to change in ways that both amazed and humbled me. I watched her belly grow, each movement, each flutter, a reminder of the life that we were creating together. I'd find her late at night, lying, awake with her hands on her stomach, her eyes closed as though she were listening to a silent symphony of life unfolding within her. We began preparing for the baby, setting up a nursery that was equal parts practical and filled with things we loved, a space that would nurture not just the child we were expecting, but also the love that had brought us here. Every decision we made, from the color of the walls to the crib, was done with care and tenderness, as if we were carefully creating a world for the new life we were about to welcome. Still, the weight of what we were about to undertake lingered, and the fear of what parenthood might bring. Would we be good enough? Would we be ready? Would our love survive the challenges ahead? Never quite dissipated. There were sleepless nights spent in quiet reflection, moments of uncertainty where we would look at each other and wonder if we were truly capable of this next step. But there was also a steady, unspoken assurance between us. No matter what, We would face it together. The first glimpse of parenthood. The day our child was born, a cold and rainy winter morning, was one of those rare moments when time seems to stop and everything else fades into the background. I was by Elena's side. Through the long hours, my heart pounding with each contraction, with each breath she took. The pain was immense. But the love and strength in her eyes as she gripped my hand made every second worthwhile. When our daughter, Sophia, was placed in my arms for the first time, everything inside me shifted. The world that had once seemed so vast and uncertain had narrowed to this small, perfect being, her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, her soft cries filling the room. In that moment, I realized how completely and utterly unprepared I was, how raw and vulnerable I felt. But there was also a fierce love, an overwhelming protectiveness that surged within me. I turned to Elena, and our eyes met across the room, a shared understanding passing between us. This was our future, this little girl we had created together. We had taken the leap, and now there was no turning back. A new rhythm. Becoming parents was both beautiful and terrifying. Our lives, once centered on our careers and ambitions, now revolved around Sophia. The sleepless nights, the endless feedings, the overwhelming responsibility. It was all consuming. But there was something profoundly grounding about it. Day. We discovered a new side of ourselves, a new dimension to our relationship, and a new understanding of what it meant to love and care for another life. I found myself learning to prioritize differently. Work became secondary. Family came first. Every morning I would watch as Elena cradled Sophia, her face glowing with exhaustion but also filled with a deep, quiet love. I marveled at her strength, her ability to give everything to our child without hesitation. We were still a team, still navigating this new terrain. And though the challenges were many, there was a certain peace in knowing we were not alone in this journey. A growing family, a growing love. As the years passed, we found ourselves adjusting again. Our careers continued to evolve, but our focus had shifted. Our family, our love, our shared life had become the cornerstone of everything we did. Paris remained our home, the backdrop of our lives, and the city that had witnessed our transformation. The streets we once wandered aimlessly now felt like familiar pathways, each corner reminding us of the moments we had shared, the love we had cultivated. Sophia grew, her laughter ringing through the halls, her curiosity boundless. The moments of quiet solitude we once craved became rare, replaced by the joyful chaos of a young family. We were learning, adapting, and finding new ways to love and care for each other. One evening, as I tucked Sophia into bed, I paused at her door, watching her sleep. There was peace in her small, steady breaths, in the way she curled up against the blanket, her hands clenched in tiny fists. I turned off the light, closing the door softly behind me, and found Elena waiting for me in the living room. A smile on her face. "I never imagined this," I said, sitting beside her. "Neither did I," she replied, her eyes soft with love. "But I wouldn't trade it for anything." And in that moment, as we sat together in the quiet of our home, the weight of the journey behind us, I knew that no matter where life would take us next, we would always have this: our love, our family, our home. The future was still unknown, but we were ready to face it together.